Hello and welcome. My name's Tim Rycroft. I'm Chief Executive at AHDB, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to the Dairy Research Conference 2021, in which we'll be showcasing the results of a 5-year dairy research partnership between AHDB, the University of Nottingham, the RVC and Harper Adams. We're excited to share the results of the programme because it was designed with industry input to address the key challenges affecting dairy farmers and their businesses. It's enabled robust, independent research needed to fill the gaps in knowledge around some of the key industry challenges, which include health and welfare, how fresh cow management can help eradicate lameness, and some new thinking around how diseases such as Johne's are spread. Feed efficiency, find out where savings can be made through using a new whole farm feed efficiency calculator. And consumer perceptions of dairy. What are the current consumer perceptions of the industry, and how can we help shoppers to make informed choices about balanced diets? Throughout the week, there's a packed agenda of sessions, including presentations, videos, and discussions, followed by an opportunity for questions with the researchers involved. And if a particular session takes your interest, make sure you keep an eye out for the road shows in 2022, where researchers will be presenting some of the practical aspects of their findings at dairy farms around the country, so you can come along to see how your farm could benefit. Thank you for joining, enjoy, and as always, please share your thoughts with us to make sure we can do the work you need to shape the future of the dairy industry. Hello and welcome. My name's Tim Rycroft. I'm Chief Executive at AHDB, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you all to the Dairy Research Conference 2021, in which we'll be showcasing the results of a 5-year dairy research partnership between AHDB, the University of Nottingham, the RVC and Harper Adams. We're excited to share the results of the programme because it was designed with industry input to address the key challenges affecting dairy farmers and their businesses. It's enabled robust, independent research needed to fill the gaps in knowledge around some of the key industry challenges, which include health and welfare, how fresh cow management can help eradicate lameness, and some new thinking around how diseases such as Johne's are spread. Feed efficiency, find out where savings can be made through using a new whole farm feed efficiency calculator. And consumer perceptions of dairy. What are the current consumer perceptions of the industry, and how can we help shoppers to make informed choices about balanced diets? Throughout the week, there's a packed agenda of sessions, including presentations, videos, and discussions, followed by an opportunity for questions with the researchers involved. And if a particular session takes your interest, make sure you keep an eye out for the road shows in 2022, where researchers will be presenting some of the practical aspects of their findings at dairy farms around the country, so you can come along to see how your farm could benefit. Thank you for joining, enjoy, and as always, please share your thoughts with us to make sure we can do the work you need to shape the future of the dairy industry.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Amanda Bennett. I work at AHDB in the Environment team, and I'm going to be your chair this afternoon for the Grass and Soil session of the Dairy Research Conference. A big welcome to all of you for joining us today. We have 4 presentations coming up this afternoon, but before I introduce our speakers to you, I would just like to go to a few housekeeping rules for this webinar. So all our attendees are on mute. However, we do encourage you to submit your questions, and the way to do that is through the box on the side of your screen to the right-hand side, where you'll be able to click on the arrow in the orange box, and that will open up the question or panel for you. And if you scroll down to where it says questions and click that white arrow, then there will be a question box there. So please do submit your questions for all our speakers this afternoon. If you could help us by putting the speaker's name as a reference point at the start, that would be very useful for later. We do have a dedicated question session towards the end of this afternoon's webinar session. So I do encourage you to put your questions into our presenters. We aim to finish at about 2. And just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and this will be made available to you after the event. So you'll be able to revisit any of the content then. Also, just to let you know that if you have any technical issues, you can also put that into the box on the side if you have any technical issues related to audio, for example, and our team behind the scenes will be able to help you with that. At the end of the webinar, we will have a short survey that will pop up. Just please take a few moments to fill that in. That really helps us to ensure that our webinar and future delivery is relevant to you. So I think that's about it for the housekeeping sides of things. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for this session. We have Elizabeth Stockdale, who is the head of farming systems research at NIAB. Elizabeth is a scientific lead on a 5-year program of work looking at soil biology and soil health. And today she's going to tell us about the work that she's done and led on developing new soil health indicators. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So Amanda's been our link into AHDB, been steering and keeping us right throughout the 5-year process. So if anything I talk about is wrong or not useful, that's clearly Amanda's fault. We've been working very closely across industry, a lot of partners within the partnership here, both research and industry partners, but also making links and making sure that we're working closely with farmers and the broader agri-industry as we go forward. And the partnership, the Soil Biology and Health Research Partnership that finishes at the end of December, has been doing a whole range of things to bring together our understanding of soil biology, to put that into the context of soil health, to look at the newest possible tools that might be available and to test them and evaluate them. But the piece I'm going to particularly talk about today is the work that's been done to really focus on developing soil health indicators that can be used effectively on farm. And so if we just start by thinking about the context of soils, we have a look at this slide that shows us the soil profile, where the soils in any particular location are the result of that complex interaction in that place between the underlying geology, whether that's laid down rocks or materials laid down by water through rivers perhaps, or by glaciers, interacting with the climate at the Earth's surface. And those processes are dominantly driven by biology. It's only when biology gets involved that this really becomes a soil, rather than being something that geologists study. But here we've got those complex interactions shown for a range of native systems over a couple of different rock types. The picture comes from Kubiena's Soils of Europe. And it gives us that picture of the soil as an interacting place where biology, weather, climate interact, and those interactions shape the kind of soil that we find in any location. Those are the interactions that shape the character of the soil, or as a soil scientist would call it, the soil type. The horizons that are seen there, the dominant soil texture, the balance of sand, silt and clay, and hence properties like the likely drainage of the soil, the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients. It's those properties, that soil character, that often sets the potential for any particular site. It will determine that combination of soils and climate about whether it's actually a good grass growing soil or one that's actually better put into something much less interesting like an arable crop. But we've got these options here for understanding and really beginning to measure and understand our soil character to help us shape and change how we manage soils. And that's done in the context of understanding then how our management interacts with those properties. So we know those underlying properties, they give us our benchmarks, our ways of thinking about the soil, but the way we then manage soil, things like stocking density, nutrient inputs, drainage effectiveness, so many things in our own management control over probably hundreds of years on any piece of land that affect then how those properties interact with one another, set levels of things like chemical nutrients and so on. So in this context, soil health are those properties that are affected by our management decisions, and understanding them really will help us to take informed action. And within the partnership, we've been working to bring together our knowledge in this area. Next slide, please. And so what we've done is have a look at not being too worried about defining soil health, but focusing on how we can give better information to help farmers manage that soil health better. So here the soil health definition picks up on that interaction between biological, chemical and physical properties in the soil. Not one or other, but that balance and interaction between them resulting in that soil health outcome. And these principles that are written around the outside here remind us of the important things that we need to take into account, not just one or two, but all of them in the context of our particular soils. And so for chemistry and physics, one of those key principles in each of the lists is about knowing our soil. In the context of physical properties, it's absolutely about knowing our soil texture, that balance of sand, silt and clay that determines the workability and, much more importantly, the trafficability of the soil. So the opportunities for that soil to be used late into the autumn, or how early in the spring it's likely to drain and be accessible for grazing. And the key there is, in terms of physical properties, is the need in terms of our management to optimise water balance, to use and maintain drains, to minimise compaction and improve soil structure so that the physical properties of soil are in their best possible state. That balance of pores that move water through the soil, like motorways taking the water away, and those small pores that hold on to water and enable grass roots to access it into dry periods. But of course, those properties interact with the chemistry. So actually the plant rooting through the system is key to whether nutrients are used effectively. It's important to know how much nutrient we've got, the right nutrients, the right amounts in the right place at the right time, targeted and precise nutrient management, but also alongside that, maintaining the soil pH, that redox environment in which all organisms are able to see and attain their balance. And pH is key here, not just for cropping, but for grassland systems, where a target pH of not dropping below 6.2 is actually quite important for maintaining the whole biological activity of the soil, so that the chemistry and physics interact to create the habitat space for that biology. And there the key principles are around making sure the livestock below ground are fed as well, if not better, than the livestock above ground, with regular inputs through plant roots and organic materials. An importance here about having a diverse diet, that diversity of plants in space, diverse lays, for example, or mixed swards, even grass clover swards, add a diversity into the diet and into the rooting systems for soils, and have a clear benefit to overall soil health. And coupled to that, a principle that's much easier in grassland than in other systems, but of moving the soil only when necessary, being sure about any tillage operations or any operations that we need to carry out, for example, to remediate compaction. So these principles brought together seem really simple, but actually give us a really strong baseline for understanding and managing our soil health. And these have been brought together in a number of publications. Next slide, please. And so we're drawing your attention here, particularly today, to the Principles of Soil Management Guide and the Measuring and Managing Soil Organic Matter leaflet, key important outputs from this project, together with information from other sources brought together and available through the AHDB Great Soils website, but also the opportunity to have a look at some resources that have been brought together through the team involved in this partnership, but in wider cross-sector work through something called the UK Soil Health Initiative. But that material's being shared with farmers and more widely through the Championing the Farmed Environment websites, where there are specific guidance and thoughts on the principles worked out in practice for particular systems. So obviously I highlight to you today that lowland livestock leaflet, but there are, for those of you with mixed farms, there are also leaflets for mixed farms and also for combinable cropping. So we've done this work to bring together the knowledge that we have, to put it into an accessible form, and we did that partly just to do that job, to make sure that the information was available, but also to underpin the development of indicators and a robust framework for measuring soil health. Next slide, please. But it's been really key to what we've been doing throughout, that we recognise that farmers are already doing much of this work, already valuing and responding to the needs of their soils in that way that we might call soil husbandry rather than soil management. Next slide, please. And that process has been a fairly complicated one looking here, but basically been a process of discussing, arguing, bringing information together, and then discussing again. So choosing the right indicators, thinking about what makes a really strong indicator, needed input both from scientists and the laboratory and those who might be using those indicators to make decisions. And that choice of indicators has also been shaped by how they might be used in practice. So it's not just about having a number, but how that number is shown and shared. And there's a whole range of information that's been brought together, both specific from local sites and local information, legislation, and the detailed process information and mechanistic models, so that we're able to take something that's like soil health and try and identify the really key things that can be measured and responded to on farm, to develop what we're calling the soil health scorecard that gives us descriptions, indicators, and turns that into a scorecard that can be used effectively. And we're using a traffic light system to indicate our need for more reflection, more management and measurement. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in practice in terms of how we might build on what we already have? Because many livestock farmers are already aware of the Healthy Grassland Soils work, which was done 5 and more years ago. SRUC and Newcastle coming together to give farmers tools to assess risks from compaction, the impacts of compaction, and then think about how that might be remediated for their particular site and soils. So that field assessment for tillage, but also for assessing compaction and depth. But separately, measurements being made on farm, and of course the farming rules for water suggest that we make regular measurements of any fertilised land in the context of its nutrient content and its pH, so that we can guide our chemistry, our management of that effectively. So we knew that this work was already ongoing, and we challenged ourselves and talked to farmers about how we might bring that together. Was the way it could be simply just linked together this information that we already had? But unfortunately, next slide please, we realised that what we really needed was actually a slightly different approach to collecting this data. And that's partly because the way in which we use this soil health data, the scale at which it needs to be collected is just slightly different. So we need to actually link in one place at one time that physical observation in the field and the soil sampled for testing. And that means we can't take usually as many samples as we might put into a bag to send away for chemistry. But we need to be more targeted than perhaps we are when we're looking at making an assessment simply to decide perhaps the depth of a subsoiling leg. And so what we've suggested, and what we suggest, is this approach that takes and identifies key sites across the farm and geolocates them, so we can go back to them time and time again. We don't need to go back to them literally every 5 minutes or even every year, but the idea is to put in a rotational approach where we might go back every 3 to 5 years to the same place. We use what 3 words as our way of going back to the same place, but you can use any geolocation. A cross on a map, creating your treasure map for soil sampling is just as useful. Sampling within 5 metres to create that 10-metre radius circle gives us a good size area to represent, but it's not too big. And then we combine then those in-field scores, the Healthy Grassland Soils methodology, counting earthworms in a block and adding that to that sample collection for extended analysis. And that whole process sounds complicated and fiddly, but it takes only about 20 minutes for each site that we visit, depending on how difficult it is to break the block apart and find all those worms. If you've got a lot of worms to count, it might take you a little bit longer. Next slide, please. And so we worked with farmers to think about how that might work, and then we've also worked with farmers to develop that scorecard approach for practical use. Those systems spread across the UK, a mix of farming systems, including particular with thanks to the grazing groups in Wessex for working with us, with Becky Wilson and others, to have a look at how they might work and fit well into dairy systems. And the key really was to develop a tool that took the kind of numbers we might get back from sending away a soil analysis, the kind of information we might collect in a field, and turn it into something that would support farmer conversation about the numbers, enable an engagement with those results, a way to make sense of the numbers. Next slide, please. So the measures that are there in the scorecard began by saying, well, what existing indicators could we already use? Where there already exist benchmarks or traffic lights, where it was already possible to interpret the data we were collecting in terms of management outcome. For example, compaction. It's entirely possible to measure, to use a penetrometer, the resistance of something a bit like an electric fence pole, but a measured device, to see how difficult it is to put that into the soil. And the pressures we measure, we can relate to rooting. And then we asked ourselves, well, yeah, that's fine, but how do we use that measure in practice? So it isn't just about having the benchmarks. You'll see those other comments that say, well, is it really practical for a farmer? So, for example, bulk density has very clear traffic lights, but it's a fiddly measurement. It requires volumetric sampling, and it would take quite a long time to be done on farm scale. So we said, well, it probably doesn't fit, at least not in the first GP's approach to soil health measurement. It might be something we come back to as a specialist when we begin to realise that perhaps there's a problem with our structure. But in the first instance, assessing structure using visual assessment, seeing how well a block breaks open, identifying that limiting layer, as by the Healthy Grassland Soils card, seems to work well. So we looked at some existing indicators and challenged them. So not all of them made it past the list. We had a lot longer list than this to start with. We then took some less common indicators and said, well, there are some evaluation frameworks available for some of these things, like earthworms, like soil organic matter. Can we begin to bring those together in a way that can be used? And then we did try some of the newer indicators, particularly in our research trials, but where they were showing promise, we also brought them forward onto farm. So measures of potentially mineralisable N were used alongside respiration potential on farm. But across a wide range of trials and sites, we've also tested in parallel these DNA-based indicators to see if they will hold potential for us to begin to develop traffic lights, perhaps not now, but in the future. Next slide, please. So I talked about traffic lights. Just a quick example. The final traffic lighting system, the colouring in approach, will be shared at the end of the project, so we're not far to go. But this table comes from a set of tables that were released for consultation alongside the Measuring and Managing Soil Organic Matter leaflet back in 2018-19. But just to give you a sense of those, they haven't changed very much. What has changed is that they're not given in whole percentage numbers anymore. Is to give you this grassland data to have a quick look at. So actually, data for grassland shows there are differences by region, by dominantly climate type. So in wetter soils, that is soils in the west and in the north, tend to have higher levels of organic matter than those in the south and the east. But within grasslands, it's much more difficult to pick those differences out. And it, in fact, doesn't help us with benchmarking to split grasslands up like that. So it's actually much simpler for grasslands than it is in arable systems, where we need to take climate into account. In the context of grasslands, we simply need to look at the texture of the soil. And to do that simply, as our first look, we take that cross-compliance soil type, the texture, therefore, of the topsoil, whether it's light, medium or heavy. So light soils are those very light sandy and silty soils with less than 18% clay. Medium soils are those ones that are clay loam, sandy clay loams, silty clay loams themselves, with some body, but not at their very heavy end, where the clay becomes dominant when it becomes above 30 to 35% clay. But we can see here that we need different target ranges, different colouring in according to that soil texture. And that's because the natural ability of clay soils to hold on and stabilise organic matter is higher. And so therefore, it's possible for clay soils to maintain higher levels of organic matter. We would expect them to have higher levels of organic matter. And above 9% organic matter in a grassland in a clay soil really shouldn't be unusual. Whereas in a light soil, actually it would be a very unusual thing to find, and a 4 or 5% would be actually a really good level. Here, these levels tell us something also about the capacity of the soil to hold on to more carbon. So a soil that's already in the top end, the high levels here of green, is already quite full. Its capacity to hold and stabilise carbon is actually quite saturated. And so soils that have a capacity to really build more carbon into the system will be those where their topsoils and their subsoils are in the amber or red category. And that's relatively unusual because grassland farmers tend to have done a good job of maintaining soil organic matter through organic matter inputs through time. Next slide, please. So if we take those benchmarking, those colouring in, I've just talked through the organic matter one, but we can do the same thing for our visual assessment scores, our pH and P, K and Mg based on RB209 frameworks. Organic matter there I've just talked through, also numbers of earthworms and potentially mineralisable N as that microbial indicator. We can see how here on a research site how those scorecards might stack up. And this just gives us a really quick picture. It's just a GP's look, it's nothing in detail, though there's more detail here if we want to follow it up. So the intention in the scorecard work is not to take away the numbers, but simply to support those numbers with the colouring in. So we see here in the far left of the screen the control plot, a plot which has received no regular organic matter inputs apart from those in the growing crops in a mixed rotation for more than 25 years. And we see there's quite a lot of amber colours in that scorecard. As we go right here, we've got the different kinds of organic materials. I'm just going to highlight the difference here that farmyard manure and slurry applications over 23 years make. So larger buffering capacity and calcium addition through manure gives us a higher pH in those farmyard manure treated soils, and also slightly higher potassium compared to slurry, but slurry increasing nutrients in the same way over the control, even though the control is receiving what in theory are good applications of routine P's and K's fertilizers. Difference too in the organic matter, with the organic matter built slightly higher there, with the more solid, actually just more organic material returned per unit application than in the slurry system. Relatively little difference in earthworms, but a bigger difference here in terms of the microbial activity assessed by potentially mineralizable nitrogen. Less difference between the slurry and the control here, because the material that's being added gets broken down very quickly. It's not stabilizing and providing a long-term diet that supports that activity of the population. But I could talk about this slide for ages, and that's not the point. It's to show you the scorecards. So let's go and have a look at some more. These are the kind of scorecards that we've then gone on to farm to collect. More than 300 scorecards collected across the UK during the project just show the diversity of UK soils. On this slide, I've just listed some of the grassland scorecards for you to have a look at, listing for light soils and then for medium soils, dropping into heavy at the very bottom, but and in the order of organic matter in soils. So we see that actually in grasslands, although green tends to dominate our organic matters, we do find some soils with lower organic matter levels and a range of different other nutrients. Some soils high or low in phosphorus, some soils starting to get perhaps slightly critically low perhaps in pH. When we start to get down below 5.8, 5.9, we're starting to critically risk impact on productivity, as you well know. But let's have a look what that might mean. So if we're thinking then about how we might put that into practice, we take those numbers, think about them in terms of the practices we might put into place. Actually, we're already doing something that ticks this box. So this box, this improved grassland soil standard, is new on the scene. It's new, it's not been thought through alongside particularly the project work we've been doing, though we've been informing and talking with those catchment sensitive farming officers, with Natural England and with RPAs. We've been going to think about our work. But actually what I've just talked about fits beautifully here, with the idea that each year on 20% of the land we need to assess our soil structure, look at some biological indicators and record and keep those observations. Managing our soil health to keep it in best possible health for production actually also enables us to deliver some of the outcomes that government are looking for from us in terms of improved environmental value and improved ecological health, as well as maintaining those soils in their best possible production systems. So I commend you keeping an eye on that soil health scorecard. I'll be out there playing with farmers and talking about this, and so will other advisors too, as agronomists pick up and take this scorecard forward. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's great to hear how we're bringing together the chemistry, physics and biology of soil in this very simple visual way to help inform our management approaches on farm. We are getting some questions in and we are saving those to the end of the session where we will have a dedicated time for questions. So please do continue to pop them into the question box on the side of your screen. But without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our second speaker for this session. That's Dave Davies from Silage Solutions Ltd, who's going to tell us about silage clamp slippage and how to reduce the risk. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk about grass silage slippage and some recent findings. It's an ongoing problem, and I'm hearing more and more in the last few weeks of silages slipping again this year. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that this can increase the risks of mycotoxins. So if we go to the first slide, please. What is clamp slippage? It's generally in grass, and it's when the whole silage mass slips forwards, as you can see in these two pictures, particularly the one on the right. You can see the elevated part where the sheet is still on and further back, and where the silage has slipped forward, and it rips the top sheet. It leaves a massive crevice that you can lose a whole person in quite comfortably, and it means air is then penetrating that silage clamp. Like I said, increasing the risk of particularly penicillium mycotoxins have been a particular issue this year in a number of places in the UK. So what is the solution? Next slide, please. I was lucky enough to secure some funding from AHDB to look at some commercial farms in 2018 and 19. And we actually needed to build on what was already in the literature, which was very minimal, to see what the key problems were, to see whether we can actually start to move away from this slippage issue. And a number of measurements were taken, most critically silage density. And I can now run through the findings of those results and put them into perspective in terms of your practice. Next slide, please. So first of all, we measured the size of the clamps, and in 2017 I did a separate survey for AHDB, and the finding from the clamps that we looked at in this particular survey were that they were bigger. Now, I'm not saying that large clamps are going to all slip, but if you've got a higher clamp in particular, but also the width, it means that there's more weight on that silage, there's more risk of that bulging lower down in the clamp, and there's less friction from the walls to hold that in. So a larger clamp is a risk factor, but it's not the predominant risk, it's just one of those factors. Next slide, please. So we also looked at within this the dry matter. So I've got all the farms there listed on the left, and I've got the mean percentage dry matter from the samples we took from that clamp. And these would have been cord samples at specific points. And we can see, as a generalization, most of those are less than 30% dry matter. There's one exception there, or a couple of exceptions up at mid-30s, but a lot of them are low 30s or actually lower than 30% dry matter. But if we look in the second column, we can also see the range in percentage dry matters within those clamps. And with the possible exception of a couple of them, there is a big range in the dry matter content in the clamp. So there's a big range in the amount of water in different regions of the clamp. And again, it's a suspicion that it's the water in the clamp that is causing a lot of the issues with clamp slippage. So if we look at 2018 Farm 2, there's actually 11% difference in dry matter content from different parts of that silage clamp. Now, when you've got a slip clamp, unless you've resheeted the top, which I would recommend those, and I know it's a problem if you've got a slip clamp, we have got water ingress into the top of the clamp due to rainfall. But some of this is inherent within the clamp at the point of ensiling, that we have this big range in water content. Next slide, please. Now moving on, one of the key things that we should be measuring or be aware of is the density, and I'll spend a bit of time talking about density. There's a very good diagram on one of the AHDB fact sheets on how you can measure density on farm, but we can see the average density there across those farms, or the mean density in the first column. They're all pretty good, hitting the target that I have in my head of 700 in most situations, and when they haven't hit that target, they're not far below it. But most critical is the density range. And if we look at that density range, there is a massive range in densities. In most of those clamps, there's almost a twofold difference in the poorer density versus the higher density parts of those clamps. And that is where I think we have a serious issue when it comes to clamp silage slippage. So if I just follow that on into the next slide, we will see what's happening. So I've got two examples here. The first example there on the left is where we've got density, with the density increasing as we go from top to bottom. That's what you would expect due to the silage within that clamp settling as we store it. However, on the right here, we have density going down the clamp, and we can see that in that point just below or just above the bottom point, we have 514 kilograms of fresh matter per meter cubed, whereas immediately above it, we have 806 kilograms of fresh matter per meter cubed. This means that we've got a significant weight above a reduced weight and a reduced density. This enables this likely result is when we're cutting out that clamp face, we get a bulge forming, the top silage then slips down and it causes an avalanche and a slippage coming out. And this is what we saw on most of the farms, the B version. Most of the farms analysed had this system. There were a couple of farms that were closer to the A system, but the majority were nearer the B system. Next slide, please. So this is really breaking down the densities on the farms where we had where we measured the density, and we can see that the positive results, there's only a couple of negatives. These two negative results are showing that the density increased with depth in the silage clamp. All the other farms had a problem where there was higher densities above lower density silages, and the figure there shows how much denser the silage was above. So if we take 2019 farm 2, that's 450 kilograms more fresh matter higher in the silage clamp than lower down in the silage clamp. So that's a serious weight issue. And it's a bit like the three little pigs and the one little pig building his hand in sand. There's no solid foundation if we don't get this density correct as we go through that silage clamp. Next slide, please. This is a different way of putting that. So if we look at 2018 farm 2, that actually was very good in terms of its density gradation through the clamp. So it was going the right way. And it was almost okay. It needed 14 cubic meters of silage in one zone to actually be higher weight per cubic meter than lower in the clamp. Whereas the others, they only needed 2-3 cubic meters above to cause this weight differential issue and the potential for this clamp slippage to occur because of this weight differential. Next slide, please. We also looked at particle size. This was using a modified particle size separation kit developed at Harper Adams on an AHDB project, where we're actually moving away from the Penn State separator because grass silage has a completely different particle size format than maize silage. And the results of this, again, particle size has been something that has been highlighted in the past as being an issue in terms of too short a chop length with wet silages causing slippage. And if you think about it, actually how that could bind in, longer particle sizes in damper silage, wetter silages is likely to help bind that silage into the silage clamp. So next slide, if we look at the percentage fresh weight passing through the different sieves. So if we look at the percentage of those samples that are taken from that and pass through this separator, we can see that size passing through the 32 millimeter sieve, so in theory, less than 32 millimeters long, that the vast majority of the silages from these slip clamps had, well, 75% here for farm 2, but the rest of them are over 90 or approaching 90 or over percent of the weight passing through a 32 millimeter sieve, so less than 3 centimeters long. If we then look at the 19 millimeter sieve and what passes through that, we're still hovering around the 50%. Bearing in mind these are wetter silages, and past data suggests that wetter silages needed a longer chop. We are chopping these wetter silages far too short to enable them to be retained in the silage clamp and reduce, or not retained, but reduce the risks of slippage. Next slide, please. The final thing, and this is obviously done from the, can we go back? I'll ask you when I want that. Thank you. We can actually see that where we have the packing angle, and this is all done from the verbal communication with the farmer at the time, where we have a 10-degree packing angle, most of the tractor weight is actually down through the silage. Whereas if we go to a 20-degree angle, we've got that weight through the silage, but we've got an increasing weight also coming back as we're packing. And then we go to a 30-degree angle, there's a significant pressure coming back. And too many farms or too many people filling silage clamps are actually packing at too steep a packing angle. This is causing a rip effect as you're filling the clamp, and thus increasing the risk of this crevice forming within the silage clamp during feed out, because we're forming those friction lines at the point of packing. So again, we should be packing at a much lower packing angle than probably on some of those farms is happening. And really, we can move away on most farms from the Dorset wedge approach, because most farms are being filled within a day. And the Dorset wedge was designed to try and get that silage covered where we're filling over multiple days. The only risk of going too shallow is that you're actually rolling the front of the clamp a lot more than you are the back of the clamp. But I think really we should be considering reducing that angle of packing if we've got particular concerns about packing angle and density. Next animation, please. So if we look at an angle and the downhill force, the steeper the filling angle, the greater the downward force down that slope, the greater the ripping action of that within the clamp. Next slide, please. So there are a number of risk factors. The main factor is probably inconsistent density. And I know, speaking to some of the farmers that we were going on, they admitted that when they're filling the clamp, something happens. Maybe it's time to let the cows out. So they go off for half an hour, let the cows out, help with other jobs, and then they come back and continue consolidation. We need to be consolidating the first load that comes in exactly the same as we're consolidating the last load to get that even consolidation throughout that clamp. That's good practice, even if you've got ideal conditions, higher dry matter silages. We should really be compacting every load into that clamp. Another one is that, oh, I put 2 tractors in on the top for the last half of the clamp and only 1 tractor at the start. That again is causing this inconsistency in silage density. Clamp dimensions, the higher and wider the silage clamp may contribute to increased risk of slippage. Obviously, with farms numbers, the dairy cow numbers increasing, we do need to increase the silage clamps. I did hear an interesting scenario from one of the farmers that uses earth wall banks, that maybe if he angled those banks so that they were actually wider, there was a narrowing of the clamp as you came forward, that would help hold that silage in. And I should have contacted him before today's webinar to see whether it worked this year. We can over consolidate grass silage with a lower dry matter of 25%, and that might exacerbate the slippage problem because we're actually squeezing that liquid out of the silage. Again, chop length, I think there's some very good guidance on the AHDB website. We need to follow that. And to be honest, there's no excuse these days, because you've got a little dial in the forage harvester. If it's a self-propelled, you can alter that chop length at the touch of a button. And if we're making this high quality silage with high digestibility, low fiber, I think we're perfectly reasonable to go up to a slightly longer chop length, because they consolidate very well because of the lower fiber, the better ability to digest that in the animal. And then we should be using a filling angle less than 20 degrees, because that, again, if we go above that, we increase the risk of slippage. Now, I don't know whether there is a link between more slippage at the moment, or whether I'm just hearing about more slippage and high quality silage, but I think it's essential that we carry on making this high quality silage. It is the best nutrient for the housed cow. It's essential that we make more from our silage. So really we need to follow these rules in terms of reducing clamp slippage by having that high quality silage. So follow the rules and carry on making high quality silage. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dave. Really good overview about how we can reduce the risk there of silage clamp slippage. Some really good tips. So yes, please do continue to put your questions into the question box for the session at the end. And without further ado, I'm going to move on to our third speaker of the session. And I'd like to introduce Ellie Sweetman, who's a forage crop specialist at NIAB, who's going to talk to us about the recommended grass and clover list varieties. Ellie, over to you.
Thank you very much. So if you can move on, please. The recommended grass and clover list is about continuous improvement of the varieties and species that are included in those lists. So perennial ryegrass, Italian ryegrass, hybrid ryegrass is in there as well. We also have white clover and red clover. And there are also some descriptive lists that run within that programme on lucerne and cockfoot as well. So the main emphasis is about continually looking to raise the bar, and that's in terms of the productivity of the soils that we'll get on farm and increasing the nutrient use efficiency. Can you move on, please? Thank you. The trial sites are located around the UK for the national listing. That is a legal requirement in order to have a variety sold in the UK. It needs to be on the UK national list. So there, all the sites are included in that. Could you move on, please? Thank you. And at those sites, 3 of them include the recommended list trials work, but the national list data will feed into that data matrix as well that's used to make the decisions. So the main assessments that are made in order to be able to make decisions on those varieties and recommend whether they'll be recommended for use are certainly for perennial ryegrass in particular, there are years that are conservation management and years that are simulated grazing management to get as good an all-round assessment of the varieties as possible. And that is for the other species to a certain extent as well, but just in different combinations of management at different times. So the digestibility is an important one, and that's also used to calculate the metabolisable energy content. Crude protein is measured in clover and the other legumes, and the overall dry matter yield is the data that most people are interested in, not only over the annual life cycle and the years of the trials system, but also throughout the seasonal growth from early spring through to autumn. Ground cover suggests how well a variety will persist through the season as well as from year to year. And winter hardiness is particularly important in some areas of the country. Disease resistance, again, is a regional issue to a certain extent. So they're measured at a couple of additional disease sites in southwest England and West England. Could you move on, please? Thank you. So all the data is brought together into a quite complex matrix from many trials over many years. And then the decisions committee is a group of farmers, grass breeders and independent advisors and agronomists from industry. To start with then, once we have a variety that is approved to be on the national list, then the data for England and Wales is combined with additional data. If they bring something new to the list, they have to bring come in over and above the mean of the varieties on that list. So they have to punch above their weight, if you like, to get on at all. And then, yes, can you move on, please? And then to continue on the recommended grass and clover list, after a 5-year period as a provisional recommendation, so a PD variety, which is provisional general use, and a PS, which is specific use, where there's a particular strength in one area that might be really good for seasonal grazing, or it might really stand up above and beyond the others for conservation, but not necessarily be as strong across the board on all attributes. And then if the variety continues on the list, it needs to still hold its own. It needs to be better than or at least equal to the mean of the group, which, bearing in mind with new varieties coming on the list every year, that mean is the bar is rising every year. Can you move on, please? Thank you. So the areas that we are looking at in the current trial system that are of particular interest is the ME yield. So it's looking at how much energy you can get from a hectare of growing that particular grass or variety. Persistence, so can we get these varieties well established, but then they can continue to be productive for a good few years. Some varieties now are, well, there's more later maturing, later heading perennial ryegrass varieties on the list for extending the production, and the seasonal performance is also scrutinised quite carefully. Disease resistance is important in changing climatic conditions, where there are some of the conditions are more encouraging, shall we say, to some of these diseases that do actually pull the yields down quite considerably. But then it's also about balancing the yield and quality. So if you're just going for as much as you can actually produce, then your digestibility might not be there. So it's getting that balance right. And some crossbreeding, particularly with the hybrid ryegrasses, are looking at bringing in, so some festiloliums, for example, bringing in fescue traits as well as the yield of the ryegrass traits. So there's some work continuing in that area. Please move on. Looking ahead, as the programme continues to develop, I don't think it will be too surprising that some of the key areas to continue to focus on are drought tolerance. And as we've had some very dry conditions in the last few years in particular, some of that data is contributing to the performance of those varieties and therefore will affect their ranking and recommendations on the list. Disease resistance, as previously mentioned, is coming through quite strongly. It's also about reducing nitrogen use. Now, the nitrogen that is used in these trials is aiming to show these varieties off to their potential, but stay within the requirements of the arbitrary or nutrient management recommendations and guidance. And so whilst we're seeing higher yields year on year, that's for the same amount. So we're getting more and more efficient in terms of the nitrogen use that's going into it. The role of legumes is going to become increasingly important, whether you're looking at a grass white clover sward or including red clovers and lucerne, or even less used ones like sainfoin, which has got lots of strength. Not currently into the system, but that's not to say that the system won't develop or the programme won't develop over time if it's required by the growers. It's looking at reseeding, the timeliness of that. We have to consider when does it make it a good return on investment, and at what point is it much more efficient to invest in resowing. And they're also thinking about the use of endophytes in some of the other countries, particularly countries like New Zealand. Some of the endophytes developed to have a positive effect on the development and the health of the growing plant, but they're not something that we currently bring over to the UK for these conditions. So lots of different things to think about in terms of development ongoing of grass varieties, species, and the development in the future. Thank you. Just a last couple of slides just to show you, I won't go through them all, but some of the traits of some of the new varieties that are on the recommended list for this year. So we've got a white clover there, we've got one of those festiloliums, as well as a couple of late perennials, and there's a second slide here with some more on there as well. So it's all about bringing yields in, it's all about getting some good quality digestibility and there's some good energy, but also considering the ground cover, good persistence, and the resistance to crown rust. So these new varieties are bringing these onto the list, and this information is included in the published grass clover list. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ellie. It's a really good to hear that overview of that whole process and all the different traits and characteristics of importance that need to be investigated and looked at to produce that recommended list. Thank you very much. We will take questions in the dedicated question session at the end. So please, again, do type your questions into the panel on the right-hand side. So we have our next speaker is my colleague Siwan Howatson, Senior Scientist in the Animal Health and Welfare Team at AHDB, and she's going to spend a few minutes now just giving us a brief overview of her master's degree research on utilisable, metabolisable energy, which I feel is too much of a tongue twister, Siwan, so over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have this opportunity this afternoon to provide you with a brief introduction into my master's thesis, which was self-funded at Harper Adams University. And as Amanda alluded to in this short presentation, I will be answering the question, should utilisable, metabolisable energy make a comeback? Next slide, please. So one proven way of driving improvements in productivity is through benchmarking and the use of key performance indicators. And I was interested to see if there was a common KPI, apart from milk from forage, that we could use across both block and all year round calving herds that would better allow farmers to quantify, compare and benchmark production from homegrown grass and forage. And the UME KPI was the one that I was going to look into. Next slide, please. So UME, utilisable metabolisable energy, is defined as the ME values of homegrown and bought feed and are subtracted from the ME requirements of livestock to give you a balance, which is the UME, representing the energy output from grassland. This is calculated by firstly looking at cow requirements by taking into account maintenance, energy required for maintenance, milk production, activity allowance, live weight gain and loss, and also pregnancy. Next slide. Thank you. And secondly, you then need to calculate everything that makes up the feed supply. And you can see that that is from graze grass, conserved forages, to anything that's brought onto the farm. Thank you. And then lastly, you need to know the total area you wish to assess UME for. And this could be the total grassland hectares for your farm or the hectares of your grazing platform only. And for this study, we did look at both. Next slide. So the research was carried out in 2 stages. The first one was via an anonymous online survey to assess current practices on British dairy farms regarding grassland management and the use of key performance indicators relating to grassland. Following a 13-week live period, the survey respondents totalled 166 dairy farmers across GB, and there was a mixture of farmers managing block and all-year-round calving herds. The 2 main results I just want to highlight from this survey today was that the farmers who participated in the survey considered grass and homegrown forage to be of importance to their farming system. And the results demonstrated that milk from forage on a scale of 1 to 5 was more important than UME as a grassland KPI. Interestingly, 88% of the survey respondents indicated that they either did not use UME or had not heard of UME before. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the second part of the research was carried out with 28 dairy farmers across Britain who participated in the study by providing data to allow me to calculate their milk from forage, UME and grassland utilisation. Again, just some of the highlights from the data results. So the overall mean whole farm UME was 58.6 gigajoules per hectare. And to put that into a little bit of content, if UME values exceed 90 gigajoules per hectare, the productivity of grass is satisfactory. And if we have values below 40 gigajoules per hectare, this highlights low grass productivity and poor utilisation of pasture. And the graph just demonstrates there the difference between the UME for whole farm, which was all of the grassland areas in the blue bars, and the green bars are the grazing platform hectares only. And then you've got the split between all year round spring block calving herds and autumn block calving herds there as well. The current analysis confirmed that a greater dependence on purchase concentrate across these systems resulted in a decrease in UME, supporting previous studies that excessive purchase concentrates reduce the efficiency of pasture with any given system. Next slide, please. So just a few points for conclusion. So the current study highlights that British dairy farmers are aiming to improve pasture utilisation. And from the farmers that participated in the survey, the mean grass production was 12 tonnes dry matter per hectare, which highlights an opportunity to improve overall pasture production by at least 2 tonnes dry matter per hectare. It also demonstrated that there is an important role of focusing on pasture utilisation on dairy farms, and this could be through monitoring UME. The result also highlighted that dairy farmers perceived grass and homegrown forage of great importance to their farming system, and they regarded milk from forage as the grassland KPI that could help them improve their grass and forage productivity further. Promoting the benefit of UME as a grassland KPI could encourage further improvements in grassland management by focusing on that utilisation. The further work would be needed to determine UME output per field, as this would give a greater insight into the management practice and farmers' decision affecting UME. And just my last slide, please. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the participants in the survey, so the 20 and the 28 dairy farmers who were involved in the data collection. Also, a big thank you to my colleagues within AHDB for their support during my research, and to my supervisor at Harper Adams University and Professor Liam Sinclair. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Siwan. Very good. Yes, so thank you very much to all of our speakers for a very wide-ranging and interesting set of presentations focusing on grass and soils. I'm now joined by my colleague, Kate Harris, who is our Dairy KE Manager. She has been diligently monitoring all the questions coming in. So thank you to our audience for participating in that as well. Could I invite all of our speakers back onto the screen for our Q&A session now. Just a reminder to keep your own mics on mute, but be ready to turn them on again when the questions come your way. So Kate, over to you for some of the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, lots of questions coming in. I'm going to go to Elizabeth first, if that's okay. A couple of questions for you, Elizabeth. The first one is, are there any software packages out there to record all of the information that you mentioned so that people can refer back to that in future years?
So the AHDB programme has focused on working out what should go into a package like that. And I am expecting that there will be a number of opportunities. There are none I am currently aware of that do that job, bar one sort of. So there is a regenerative agriculture package called Soil Mentor, which is actually targeting people making observations in the field. It doesn't include the chemistry at the moment, but is targeting those people making the measurements in the field and wanting to keep a record of those. But as this work, we've been working obviously with the industry, we're expecting some of those opportunities and options to be brought alongside perhaps options that you're already receiving from other providers, and also other benchmarking opportunities going to come. So not just yet is the simple answer to the question.
Okay, thanks. And whilst your mic is on, quite a topical question for you. If my soils are in good condition, can we reduce our inputs this year as it's got so expensive and play catch up in later years, or is that a dangerous thing to do?
So we manage PKs, MGs in the context of a rotation. So a decision in a single year is not a disaster, but actually if that means that we're then going to wait another 5 years before we continue to maintain, that's not a great idea. So we can, with PKs and MGs, we can look at shuffling our rotational planning to take account of fertiliser prices. That's certainly possible, as long as we don't step back from maintaining those indices, because as soon as we start to let them fall, it's really difficult to bring them back up again. It's a lot harder. So it's a really important thing to keep an eye on that. But in terms of nitrogen, which is the really costly one this year, there is some evidence that improved soil structure improves nitrogen use efficiency. Obviously, if we've got swards that are fixing well and actually we've got our fixation away well, we might also be able to reduce our nitrogen use. In fact, we probably should be thinking about how we can do that to maintain the clover in the sward most effectively. And so there's a balance there. Certainly what we do know is that the optimum, the economic optimum rather than the technical optimum, so we'll get the same maximum yield at the same point on the response curve, but actually whether that's cost effective changes with both the price of the outputs and the inputs. And with fertilizer prices increasing, it's pretty sure that in most systems the optimum will be dropping, and it's possible through RB209 and some of the guidance available through AHDB to do that bit of a sum for yourself, to have a look at what the differences in price changes might mean for application optima. But for most people with those fertilizer prices going crazy, it will be possible in terms of nitrogen to be economically optimum, though not technically optimum, economically optimum at a lower nitrogen rate.
Brilliant, thank you, Elizabeth. Dave, I'm going to come to you now, if you could turn your mic on. So in terms of those farmers out there, and I guess probably the majority of farmers using a contractor to do their silaging, what's the conversation that they should be having with their contractor to get optimal chop length and consolidation to avoid slippage, bearing in mind that they are always really busy people desperate to get to the next farm, and we're quite often sort of up against the weather. How do we manage to optimize that?
So the weather is the only variable that should not be in your control. I would say that with the contractor, you've actually got the advantage that if they are rolling the clamp, there is no excuse for them to be running off to do another job. Whilst when there's a farmer doing it, you can say, well, yeah, that other job is more urgent. So it's about that even consolidation. So the contractor should manage that better in some respects than a farmer doing his own work, because he hasn't got other distractions. But the bottom line is you're paying the contractor. And if you get clamp slippage, it's costing you thousands. So you need that job done. And, you know, there's a lot of good contractors out there. The weather is a challenge, but we should not be thinking that our dry matter is not changing in the field during that day. So we need to be keeping an eye on that. There's a simple hand squeeze test that, again, that information is in many fact sheets. There's some information on the AHDB website, but we need to be just monitoring that every hour or so and altering the chop length accordingly. And yes, it's not simple because things change. It's farming. They've always changed, and climate change is causing it to happen more frequently. But we do need to pay attention to those two things. And monitor.
Thank you, Dave. I may come back to you in a second, but I'm going to move on to Ellie now. So Ellie, are the grass breeders intending changing their fertiliser application approach around the volumes and the timings of applications as regulations for applications change for farmers?
The applications of nitrogen are, as I say, within the recommended guidelines for nutrient management already, but the aim is to make sure the variety is able to reach its potential within those requirements. So it is an item that's on the table in terms of the project board that are involved with overseeing the programme. It will be something that's kept continually under review, but at the moment there's no short-term requirements to change any of them. There has been some work done in the last few years or previous few years about looking at the recommended list varieties and their ranking under a lower nitrogen input system, and it was found that the ranking stayed the same, and that was at a like at a 200 and 100 kilo nitrogen applications annually. So the main thing is that the varieties on the list, the growers can be confident that if they select those varieties in whatever mixture, they will see the performance, the sort of performance that they can get out of it. So it is under review, certainly. But I think it's not as high as a lot of people think is the application rate.
Brilliant, thank you, Ellie. Siwan, just coming to you with a question. What were the farmers with the high UME output doing differently, do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So what we saw from the farmers with the highest UME was that there was a significant positive correlation with optimum grassland production, dependence on grass and silage, so they were less dependent on purchased feed, and also we had optimal stocking rates. And apologies if you can hear the squeaking in the background.
No problem. Thank you very much. I'm just going to come back to Dave again with another question. You mentioned adding extra tractors towards the end when you're filling the pit is not a good idea. But would you continue just to use one tractor, even if it takes longer, leaving the pit open to the air for longer before it can be covered?
No. What I want is consistent compaction throughout, and ideally 2 tractors in the bottom. It's all about consistency. So if you you know, there's a time management issue there. So if you find time at the end of the day to put 2 tractors on, then that's actually exacerbating your problem. So you either find time to put 2 tractors on throughout the clamp filling, or you use 1 throughout. And ideally we should be using 2 because that speeds up the process. It actually improves our silage quality. But if you can't, it's about consistency, and it's got to be consistent, otherwise we're going to increase these risks of, it was the key finding from that piece of work was this inconsistent compaction. And then when you look at that data in terms of the density through that clamp, it becomes obvious. If you see a lower density, it's half as dense as some silage above it. Well, when you feed out, it's got to go somewhere and it slips out.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying that, Dave. And the final question is for Ellie. So the recommended grass and clover list, could it be made more sort of system orientated? So depending on whether you're rotational grazing or set stocking or using cut and carry system, could it be more orientated towards those systems?
There's a project going on with a couple of organisations that are linked to the list at the moment to look at developing a tool that will enable decision making on that basis. So something is currently under development, which would allow, to a certain extent, some regionality, but also, depending on the system and the use as well, to help determine which would be the best variety or group of varieties most appropriate to select from for that system in a mixture.
Thank you.
I can't tell you the time frame for that. I'm not directly involved, but it's in development.
Thank you.
Have we got time for one more question, Kate? Anything else? No, there were several coming in. I appreciate you have you've sort of rationalised them in lieu of time.
Yeah, I have got one more. She's coming back to Elizabeth again. Did you measure differences between dairy farms who are paddock grazing or set stocking or zero grazing? So, focusing on the sort of systems there.
We made some observations in different grazing systems. We didn't make enough comparisons to make that robust, but I think what surprised people, and that was mostly done with farm walks, was actually how that difference wasn't as large as they expected it to potentially be, and the other factors in terms of the system, how the whole farm system was working, were having a larger impact on that soil health. So the key principles really are that might drive soil health in that context, the biological health particularly, are that ability to return more residues. So where people were using, say, farmyard manures rather than slurries, and I know that's relatively uncommon in dairy systems, but where perhaps we've also got separated slurries compared with liquids, and equally where systems were moving towards a lighter touch in terms of reseed, so less cultivation. Those were bigger impacts in the system in terms of what we were physically seeing in the soils and in terms of biological indicators. And that's not surprising because they are bigger drivers on terms of that biological community in soils. The tweaks that we make around grazing are around just the quality of the return and the timing of the return. So it's about managing our diet a little bit rather than massively changing our diet. And it's those little tweaks in diet that we can't make maybe harder to spot in terms of these soil health indicators. So I'm not saying there aren't differences, I'm just saying there are differences that are difficult to see. And if we're seeing benefits in terms of turnout, in terms of usability of grass, that's probably also feeding through and showing us something about the condition of the soil.
Sorry, one final question again for you, Elizabeth. It's literally just come in. Was there a difference between organic and non-organic?
In dairy systems, there's relatively little difference, again, because the systems are relative. If we look at them, they overlap hugely in terms of the management practices. It's just as likely actually to find good clover swards in a conventional dairy system as it is in an organic one. So again, the key drivers are about the returns of organic materials and how they're being handled. And that isn't about standards we're working to, it's about the attention to detail in the farming system. So in general, across farming as a whole, we see better soil health on average in organic systems, but actually in dairy that overlap becomes huge, and so there isn't something that really stands out.
Thank you. That's it from me, Amanda.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate, for facilitating the questions there. Really appreciate that. Yes, thanks again to all of our speakers, not only for your informative presentations, but also the answers now to your questions, and also for keeping to time. Very much appreciated. Thank you to our audience as well for your participation in this Q&A session, and again to Kate for hosting those. And also behind the scenes, we've got Carrie-Anne who's dealing with the slides, so a big thanks to her as well. So in this session, we focused on grass and soils. We've heard about the importance of soil health, how we can measure and monitor that, management factors to mitigate the risk of silage clamp slippage. Heard about the importance of the different traits and characteristics of new varieties on the recommended grass and clover list, and how we can consider utilisable, metabolisable energy as a KPI for grassland as well. So if you want to revisit any of the content, this session today will be has been recorded and will be made available online, and registered delegates will also be sent a link to access that after the event. Just to flag up as well, the Dairy Research Conference is on all week. So tomorrow we have a session on breeding and genetics, and on Friday on optimising young stock performance. So if you haven't registered for those sessions and are interested in the topic areas, please do book onto those sessions as well. Just a final comment from me, to take the time after the session has finished, when the webinar closes, you will get a pop-up for a survey to fill in your feedback, and we would really value that feedback on our webinar content. So it just remains me to say thank you very much to everybody yet again, and thank you for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your day.